Welcome to London. I'm Tanya Beckett. In the Treaty of Maastricht, the European Union outlines 4 freedoms necessary for a single market: the free movement of goods, services, capital and labour. But a wave of anti-immigration feeling in the UK and other European countries seeks to undermine this founding principle. What could that mean for the way we work and do business? There are 3.3 million EU nationals living here in the UK, a third of them in London. On average, they tend to be younger, better educated and more highly skilled than indigenous Britons. And they're more likely to be employed, according to government figures. Some employers say these workers fill the skills gap in the economy. But there's also evidence that migrant labour has depressed wages for low-skilled workers in the UK. With me now a panel of guests, each of whom have lived or worked overseas. Alexander de Pledge is an entrepreneur who founded Hassel.com, an online marketplace for cleaners. Professor Christian Dustmann is director of the Centre for Research and Analysis on Migration at University College London. And Nida Broughton is chief economist of the Social Market Foundation, which looks at the impact of economic and social policy. Welcome to you all. Christian, let's start with you. Is it possible to say whether immigration is generally a net benefit if you look at a broad economy or not?
Well, I think it very much depends on the needs of the country to which immigrants are going, and it depends on the type of immigrations we are looking at. And that has, of course, changed over time quite dramatically. So, for instance, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, European countries needed unskilled immigrants to staff their factories. Today, that has changed. So we're looking for skilled immigrants who can fill skill gaps. However, there are winners and losers. Not everybody may necessarily gain from migration. Some people may be in competition with immigrants, and that happens particularly at the low end of the wage distribution, while others, to whom immigrants are what we call complements in the way they are producing, are certainly benefiting.
So, Nida, if we went to a situation whereby there was a level playing field for EU workers and non-EU workers, how might that affect the picture, do you think?
Clearly, there is a question also about what kinds of workers firms will actually be able to recruit. So, more likely than not, you'd probably end up with some kind of system that was skewed towards higher paid, higher skilled workers. Obviously, that's okay if you're a firm that hires those sorts of workers, but actually, you know, for firms, say, in the accommodation sector, in the food sector, they're very dependent actually on the lower skilled end, and they probably won't be able to fill those jobs anymore if we don't have freedom of movement.
Christian, does the picture vary according to whether you're talking about low-skilled labour coming in or high-skilled labour coming in, or is it necessary right across the board if you're going to have a net economic impact which is positive?
Well, I think Nida pointed out a very important point. So if we look at, for instance, the UK agricultural sector, that sector is producing a good which is traded in international markets. So the blueberries produced in the UK can also be sourced from Poland. Now, in order to be competitive for a blueberry producing company in the UK, the company has to produce for at least the same price than the Polish company. Paying very high wages, of course, would very seriously harm that possibility. And we have in all European countries agricultural workers coming from further eastern countries to do this type of work for wages which allow companies to be competitive.
And just to add another point to that is that a lot of these workers are highly, highly flexible. So, for example, your seasonal fruit picking is the obvious example where you've got people who are prepared to come in for a short period of time and then return afterwards. What happens to those sorts of workers? And, you know, fruit picking's an example, but it happens, you know, across sectors. You get workers who come in temporarily when firms here would otherwise be at full capacity. They do the jobs, then they return. And, you know, that's a net benefit to the economy.
And Alex, as somebody who founded a business, and you're very dependent, in this particular case, on EU workers, it's essential for you. Why?
Being in the technology sector, 65% of my workforce that worked on the platform doing marketing, engineering, customer service were from outside the EU. So I think it's not just what we were selling, but the makeup of the business as well was incredibly dependent.
Now, Christian, we're having this discussion, of course, in the context of the fact that the UK has voted to leave the EU, for Brexit. And this, of course, will have an impact, but we're not entirely sure what impact, on access to the UK for EU workers. But if you look at the UK as a whole, how has it been affected by access to that workforce?
Well, for an entrepreneur or for a firm, it is, of course, advantageous to have access to a pool of workers of 500 million rather than 60 million. So from the perspective of firms, to be able to source skills and necessary skills from a larger pool is clearly an advantage. And the EU is giving that advantage. The other point, of course, is that under free mobility, there is no red tape.
Alex, I can see you nodding vigorously there. It's just easier to hire workers from the EU than it would be to hire those from outside.
I mean, it costs nothing. So if I choose to hire a developer from France, it costs me the airfare versus one from the UK, if you can find one in the UK, that is. Whereas we did try to hire someone from outside the EU, from Israel, and 6 months and about £10,000 later, I just gave up because the red tape is so great to hire from outside the EU. Now, people will argue, well, then that, it will be easier once we treat everyone the same. But in my experience of the visa system, the minute that you put any kind of red tape there, it's costly and it takes a long time, which holds very young companies or very fast-growing companies like mine was. It holds them back.
Christian, one of the issues raised with regards to immigration in the UK is the so-called fiscal burden. So there has been a lot of debate about benefits, for example, offered to immigrants, and also whether they pay their way, however you want to define that. What does your research tell you on that?
Well, that's a very important aspect, and the public is very concerned about that. Now, we have done research for the UK, and what we find is that immigrants from European countries in particular pay far more in terms of taxes than what they take out in terms of transfers and benefits. So they are a clear fiscal net contribution to the UK system.
Why is that the case, do you think?
There are several reasons for that. One reason is they draw less on benefits. But another very important reason is they have very high participation rates. So the participation rates, so the share of workers, the share of people who come from European countries and who are in the workforce is actually higher than that of native workers. So that increases, of course, their contribution.
Nida, do you think there is any need for UK workers to feel that their jobs are being taken by immigrants? Because it is that feeling of threat, isn't it, sometimes?
Yes, and I imagine there are individual circumstances where people might well be up against workers from overseas. But if you look in the aggregate at the kind of whole picture, you find actually there's pretty much no link between unemployment and immigration. So it's really quite hard to say that jobs are being threatened. And let's not forget, actually, that a lot of workers and migrants come over here and they create jobs. They set up new companies. They actually, provide prosperity for an area. So it's not a kind of one-way street.
Do you think, Alex, that the government fails to communicate exactly what Nida is saying and Christian is saying here?
Without a doubt. I think there's this misconception that, and it was definitely in the run-up to Brexit, that immigrants were taking jobs. But what was really interesting, I think the Wall Street Journal did a great piece of analysis where they overlaid immigration rates, but also jobs that had left a region and gone to somewhere like China. And what you actually found was no correlation between high levels of immigration and Brexit. You actually found a correlation between high levels of job outsourcing overseas and Brexit. So this is not a conversation for me around immigration. This is a conversation around globalisation and how we've left behind generations of people that are not equipped for the current modern world of work. And in my industry, such as technology, we have hundreds of thousands of jobs open, but we do not have English people that are coming out of university and or retraining able to fill those jobs. And that's why companies like mine have to look overseas for that talent to stay competitive and build valuable companies.
Thank you all for now. Well, later in the programme, we'll be looking at the potential impact of tighter visa rules on firms trying to recruit or retain staff. But first, our comedy consultant, Colm O'Regan, takes a light-hearted look at what tougher immigration rules could mean for workers and businesses in Ireland. Here's this week's Talking Point.
I'm here to explore the issues of free movement of labour across borders. But first of all, I need to find a border. Bear with me, it's around here somewhere. We're coming up now to the border between the Irish Republic and the north of Ireland, which is in the UK. Coming up now to this border, and there, we've passed it already. You wouldn't even know it was there. The only way you'd know it is that the speed limits have changed from kilometres per hour to miles per hour. But there used to be a hard border around these parts. Since 1994 and the Belfast Peace Agreement, all of that has changed, and Irish people on both sides of the border move freely every day to work and play. However, something has threatened to rain on the parade of free movement of labour between north and south, and that rainy shower is Brexit.
I think there's some kind of hardening of the border is inevitable under Brexit. For economic activity, any change in the nature of the border as it currently operates between Ireland and the UK, and in future between the EU and the UK, cannot but have a very negative effect on economic activity, particularly at local level.
This is Dundalk, a town about 4 miles from the border between the north of Ireland and the Irish Republic. I've come here to see what people are thinking about the Brexit effect. OK, so there is no hard border yet. All of this is conjecture about the future. There are no soldiers with guns or spears preventing me from crossing back and forth across the border. But as the dark clouds of Brexit gather in this area, there is a very real fear about the impact of Brexit and the return of a hard border on the working and trading lives of the people in this area.
It's not a coincidence that the 4 major towns that are suffering from deprivation on the island over decades are all border towns. It tells you exactly what economic impact a border has. It kills entrepreneurship, it kills trade, it makes life so much more difficult because it just imposes barriers.
What about the impact of Brexit and the possibility of a new hard border on the lives of ordinary people? People who come from the north across the border to work at large companies like PayPal here behind me.
PayPal moved into Dundalk in 2011. Now, a company like that is employing approximately 10% of its workforce from the north, but it's estimated that about 3,000 people are actually travelling from north to south every day. And that's just simply going to be stifled completely if we have a hard border.
My view is that the free movement of people, the free movement of labour, is extremely important and extremely positive. Increased border controls of any kind are a disincentive to anyone carrying out activities on both sides of that border.
I'm in the north of Ireland now, which just goes to show there's no impediment to the free movement of rain on both sides of the border. The border, incidentally, which is just over here behind me. Can you imagine it in a few years' time, perhaps with queues at immigration? But it's not just Brexit and borders like this which may experience restrictions on people getting to and from work. The principle of free movement of labour is under attack in the United States and all over the industrialised world.
The omnipresent Colm O'Regan there with his own take on free movement. And remember, you can see more of his short films on our website, bbc.com/Talking Business. Our guests, Alex DePledge, Christian Dustmann and Nida Broughton, are still with us here in the studio. And welcome back to all of you. Alex, let's start with the idea that you might be able to sort of tailor immigration in a way that the people coming into the country, the workers coming into the country, sort of plug holes. I'm talking about a point system, of course, and it has been discussed. What do you think about that plan?
I think any controls need to be very carefully considered, particularly right now. And I want to make this point. BCG, or Boston Consulting Group, came out with a very interesting study recently that demonstrated that the internet contributes over 10% to the UK economy. economy each year, and that's only growing. Second behind property, so outstripping manufacturing and retail. So I think the UK needs to look very carefully about what it wants to be when it grows up, and I would argue that we should be and fast becoming a digital nation, and if we want to be that and we want to be on the cutting edge, then we first of all need the immigration to plug the holes, but second of all we need to be investing heavily into our education system that's currently failing those people going through it and coming out of the other side.
Right, and we'll come back to that. Christian, what do you think about the idea of a points system? It seems like a blunt tool as far as Alex is concerned, and short-sighted.
Well, in principle, it's a wonderful idea. You have a system which allows you to tailor immigration precisely to the needs of the economy. However, that's in principle. In practice, the needs of the economy first have to be understood and communicated to those people who set up the point system. And that takes time. Now we are in very dynamic competition with the rest of the world. And these processes could be very detrimental for companies who need skills now and not next year after the point system has been adjusted in the way that those skills are considered.
So I think labour needs
red tape which we introduce with a point system, in particular if we want to apply it to European workers.
Edith, so that suggests really that our labour needs are very, very fluid, particularly in a modern, fast-moving, developed economy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And really what you want is some kind of flexible system that allows firms to hire the people they want when they want. And the points-based system, it's bureaucratic. Let's face it, it is. It's bureaucratic. You need to go through applications, you need to see who fits the visa requirements, etc., etc. It doesn't fit a dynamic economy.
Alex, where have you seen skills shortages in the UK in relation to your business particularly?
Across the board, digitally. So I talked to a bunch of 16-year-olds not so long ago and asked them, what jobs did they want to do? And it was banking, lawyers, teachers. Not one of them knew what a performance marketer was, or a full-stack developer, or a data scientist. And these are common jobs, and there's a massive shortage. That's before we even get into the world of machine learning, AI, all of the stuff that's real cutting edge, where there's only a handful of universities or pockets of people around the world. And if the UK wants to stay at the cutting edge, we need to be able to bring those resources into the UK to help develop these kinds of technologies in these companies. At Hassel.com, I had open engineering vacancies, I kid you not, for 6 months at a time. And we obviously recruited across the UK and across Europe, and I ended up with a development team that was 85% came from Europe.
On the particular kind of skills point, I think one issue that some sectors have is that they're essentially stuck in this sort of catch-22 situation, in that you're not getting enough UK graduates and skilled workers coming out through the education system, but you have a shortage of teachers in those subjects as well. So you kind of need people to come in to do the teaching to make sure actually we do provide the skills we need at the future.
Can it be done?
I think absolutely it can be done, but to be honest, you can't really do without the migration, even if it's, just in the short term, to actually kind of get the numbers up so that we can start training people to the levels we actually need.
That sounds a little bit like the UK economy is in some ways dysfunctional, that the businesses that it's running, it cannot supply anything like the skills that are needed in order to run those businesses. Does that mean it's just an international economy and actually that's a very normal situation, or is the UK very deficient?
Well, clearly after '89 we saw the world growing. We saw competition between countries which before were at two different parts of the two blocks. That has created much more dynamics in international business, and the product cycles became far shorter. The demands for skills changed much quicker. And of course the migration debate cannot really be separated when we talk about skills with the domestic production of skills, with universities, with schools, and in the UK we need to do much better than we are doing at the moment. But apart from that, all developed countries are very heavily depending on being able to source skills from other countries than their own at the moment.
Leaders nodding vigorously there. Do you think, as and when Britain leaves the EU, we will be faced with a situation where the government has to take some very serious action on this?
Absolutely. And I think, the biggest challenge is actually going to be for those firms that are employing large numbers of low-paid, low-skilled workers, because it's hard to see actually how they win under a system where freedom of movement is taken away. And I think they're going to have to adapt, whether it's through trying to pay more, but that's very difficult if you're trying to compete overseas in manufacturing, for example. Or probably you need to start thinking about automation. You need to go more capital intensive, be less reliant on low-skilled workers, more reliant on your middle-skilled and high-skilled workers. And that's going to be a big challenge for firms, I think.
Alex, do you think that business may need to fundamentally adjust its model in order to accommodate what we might well see, which is the turning off of taps when it comes to access to EU workers?
Absolutely, but I also think we have an obligation as businesses to do so. Whether we leave the EU or not, this has to happen, which is we have to match supply and demand in our workforce. So there is a great plethora of jobs that are out there and they're very well paid. And we have this disenfranchised populace that don't want to do low-skilled work, and who can blame them? But the education system needs to be rethought at every level. So we need to be retooling these people to do different jobs in the workforce. And we need to be changing the way that we educate our population to ensure that actually we're not dependent on migration, and that we're producing the right people for the right jobs here in the UK.
Nida, much has been said around the low-skilled end of the workforce, and the concern has been, and I think this has been fairly comprehensively shown, that there has been some pushing down of wages at that end of the spectrum. Would wages go back up if we no longer had access to those EU workers who were doing those low-skilled jobs?
So you're right, there has been some limited effect in terms of the wages of low-skilled workers. So yes, it is possible. I think some firms will definitely want to respond by trying to pay more to attract more workers if they couldn't rely on overseas workers quite so much. However, if you're in a very competitive industry, you can't do that. You need to keep an eye on your costs, because actually you're competing with firms overseas. So I think actually in some sectors, what they're probably going to end up doing is trying to rely much less on low-skilled workers and rely on things like machinery, more capital equipment, more automation, more technology, and that's going to be the way out.
Well, thank you to all of you very much. Christian Dustmann, Alex de Pledge, and also Nida Broughton. Well, that's it from Talking Business in London. Do join us again next week when Michelle Fleury will be in New York looking at the backlash against international trade agreements. Goodbye.